All right. My name is Faith Eichenauer. I'm doing a My America project, and I'm going to be interviewing you. I just want to make sure that I have your consent.
Yes, you do have my consent.
Okay. All right, then we can get started. My first question for you is, where did Ivan and Helen live during World War II?
During World War II, for the most part, they were living in Darmstadt, Germany.
Right. But did they lived in the Ukraine too, right?
They were born in the Ukraine, yes. I believe the town was Provolia. I may not be pronouncing it correct. And exactly where that was in the Ukraine, I would not know. I'd have to look on a map if it is even there.
Right. So when they were in the Ukraine, that's where they lived first, right? In the village in Ukraine? All right. What was their jobs and everyday life like in the Ukraine?
From what I understand, Ivan worked in a factory doing different types of factory work, mechanical work. And I believe at that time they already had collective farms in parts of the Ukraine, and that is where Helen worked on the collective farm.
Okay. So in 1939, the Germans and the Russians signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Do you know about that? Anything about that? Or?
Well, yes, that was so that Germany did not want the Russians to invade them, I believe, and they signed a mutual non-aggression type thing that one would not, fight against the other.
Right, but a couple years later, the pact ended up being broken by the Germans, right?
Correct, yes, and Germany did in fact attack Russia, and when they opened up an Eastern Front after they had conquered most of Western Europe.
Right, and they invaded the Ukraine, right?
They went through the Ukraine, they were attempting, and their ultimate goal was to capture Moscow.
Right, and when they entered the Ukraine into the town that our family lived in, what did they do to Ivan and Helen?
Well, when they were there, they occupied all of the villages on their way to the Ukraine, to Moscow, and the villagers were more or less forced to abide by the new German rule, or perform whatever services the Germans required of them. Many of the men in the village that were considered strong and capable and have had the ability to perform services that the Germans would need back in the fatherland, their home country, they were just hauling these people off to work in their factories and promote weapons and equipment and things that they needed to continue their war effort.
Right. And that Ivan went back to Germany to go work, or?
It is my understanding that he was, I'm going to use the word conscripted. He was taken and brought to Germany, and he worked in an automotive factory doing various types of work. At times it was described as a mechanic. It might have been described as a locksmith. He was working on for the Germans, manufacturing goods for their war effort.
Against his will, basically,
Absolutely,
though, right? It was
against his will.
He had no choice. He
had no choice but to do that.
If he didn't do that, what would have happened?
Probably he would have been killed.
Right. Okay. And Helen stayed in the Ukraine, right?
She was still back in her home village with her family. She had, her father was alive, she had brothers and she had sisters, she had small children, and they were continuing to live in their village, yes.
But it was very difficult, right? Because the Russians and the Germans would continuously fight back and forth between the land, right?
Yes, the war was going back and forth, and for a while it would be the Germans were in the village, and then shortly after that, or a couple of months later, it would be the Russians pushing the Germans back.
Right. So Helen, from my understanding, ended up leaving, right? She left?
Yes, she did. she ended up leaving the village because her father was taken away by the Russians. Life was so difficult for them because when the Germans were pushed out of these small villages and towns by the Russians accused the residents living there of being collaborators, and they had, no way of defending themselves, and if the Russians said you were, and they just took you and hauled you away to different labor camps or Siberia.
Wow. So she just left, picked up and left.
She left, yes. Yes. And she was headed towards Germany, so that with the expectation that she might be able to find her husband.
And Ivan, how did they end up meeting back up, Ivan and Helen?
They did meet up, and almost as if it was fate, they seemed to be going in opposite directions. He was going to her, she was going to him, and they more or less found each other.
Do you think that story is true, or do you think they...
That is the story that was told by my mother-in-law all these many years ago.
Right. And do you think that Ivan escaped the camp? Do you think he was let go? Do you think... How do you think he left if he was under German rule?
It may have been a case of maybe an Allied bombing, and he saw an opportunity to
leave,
try and get away, or, escape an assault like that.
Right.
And he took advantage of it.
But he just was able to get away, and then...
Right.
Right. So when they both met up, what was their game plan, I guess, at that point? Where did they want to go?
Probably they wanted mostly just to be able to stay alive. She had 3 children in tow. They were now in Poland, and I'm sorry, I don't know exactly the circumstances that brought them into Poland, but a 4th child was born in Lublin, Poland. They described it as a labor camp, so it seems as though they may have been rounded up by the Germans again to do more work for their war effort.
In Poland now.
In Poland, yes.
Now, do you know, because in Poland at the time, obviously the Holocaust was going on, do you know if it was a Nazi labor camp or if it was a, war effort labor camp?
It was a German labor camp. It was not a death camp that like the Jewish people were placed in, where they were being exterminated. Because the Germans were fighting a war, their manpower was active in the military. They needed manpower to continue manufacturing goods and necessary things to continue their war effort. So if they found able-bodied people that were not Jewish, they just conscripted them to work for them. You had no choice.
But life in Lublin, Poland, and working for the camp, it was not easy still, though, right? People were still dying. People were still getting killed.
Yeah, because of Allied assaults and air raids, etc. It was hard living. He worked in the factory, and if I understand and remember correctly, she was also working like in a laundry in the camp, doing work for ironing shirts and washing clothes and so forth.
And at this point, they would definitely be considered prisoners of war, probably, right? Because they're not at home, kind of taken away.
I guess under a broad description, you might consider it that, but they were not military, so whether or not they could be, given that term, I don't know.
Okay. Now, how long were they in this camp in Lublin for?
Well, their 4th child, Leonid, was born there in 1944, and my understanding is that they remained there until the World War II came to an end.
Yes.
Then you had the Allies who were rounding up all of these displaced people. Countries that had suffered so much loss of their population wanted their displaced people to come back. The French wanted to go back to France, and Polish people wanted to go back to Poland, and the Russians wanted their people back. So these displaced persons were collected, recorded, and they were going to be reciprocated back to where they belonged.
Right. Do you know by any chance who liberated the camp in Poland, or do you know if it was the United States or anything, or you think the war just ended?
I think it was a matter that Germany was defeated and there were no more Germans around, and that was the end of it.
Right. So after Lublin, Poland, they were in Darmstadt, Germany, right?
Yes,
that's where they were taken for what? To await papers?
They were located in Darmstadt, Germany, in a displaced persons camp. None of the people that were part of this effort or part of this condition had papers, identification. You couldn't prove who you were, so it was the Allied forces, and I guess it would be considered the Americans that were working hard to substantiate and make these people legal, let's say.
Right. When they were in Darmstadt, did they want to go back to Ukraine, or what was their game plan as of then?
No, when they were in Darmstadt, Germany, they did not want to go back to the Ukraine. They did not want to go back to have anything to do with the USSR, with Russia. They were afraid, because they had been part of the German war effort, that they would have been considered traitors or collaborators with the Germans and probably either killed or sent to Siberia.
Right. So they wanted to get out. They wanted to leave.
They wanted to leave, and their ultimate goal was to come to the United States.
Okay. So how did they get to Venezuela?
They were in Darmstadt from 1946 to 1948. That's 2 years. And again, in that time, another child was born. Martha was born in Darmstadt, and they were awaiting to be sent to the United States. It was very difficult at that time. The United States was not taking anybody and everybody. They evidently had quotas or their limits on how many people could be taken from Europe, and it became available for them to travel to Venezuela. And not knowing where Venezuela was, they inquired with one of the school teachers in that one of the sons was going to, where is this place? And the school teacher took their oldest son, Ivan, to a globe and put one finger on the location in Europe where they were in Darmstadt, and the other finger all the way halfway around the world to Venezuela, and said, this is where it is. And when it was out of Europe and away from the Russians, they said, we'll go.
So they just picked up and
they made the necessary papers and immunizations and whatever they were required to do by both the American forces and by the Venezuelan government to go to Venezuela.
And they did. They ended up there.
Did.
So they were in Caracas, right?
The plane landed in Caracas, Venezuela, and the majority of the people that were being sent there were sent to remote areas or the outskirts of the city. Unfortunately, Martha, the youngest child, was not well. She had a high fever, and because of that, they were kept in the city for medical care. Once she was better, they were able to stay in Caracas, and that is where they lived for the next 10 years.
Even though they were out of Europe, life in Caracas still wasn't that great, right?
No, life in Caracas was not very easy for them. Again, They were in a country that was so foreign to them as far as lifestyle, climate, language, culture, that they had to find a way to assimilate and to make a living for themselves.
Right. I have you quoted saying that Venezuela, it was very poor, and that the only thing better at Venezuela was that nobody was shooting at them.
That would probably be true. That would be true.
So in Venezuela, I remember you telling me a story that they were swindled in Venezuela or taken advantage of, the family. Do you want to explain that?
Well, yes, Venezuela was and probably still is to some degree a very undeveloped country. It has very poor living districts, and they had what they called a rancho, which was probably just 2 rooms, a room to eat and a room to sleep. And someone came and offered them a piece of property that they could buy. Mm-hmm. And with that, they would be able to put together a bigger place for them to live. There were 2 adults and 5 children. And eventually another child, son Walter, was born in Caracas, so they needed more space. And unfortunately, the person who sold them this property was a lawyer who was managing the affairs for a wealthy person, and he needed money, so he sold this man's property. And after the Studenko family had worked several years in making a home for themselves, this man returned to Venezuela and wanted to know what they were doing on his property. And it turned out to be a very large legal hassle for them to get that issue resolved.
Right. So while they were in Venezuela, they were awaiting to try and come to America, right?
It would almost seem probably from the beginning of their arrival in Venezuela, their ultimate dream was to come to the United States, and they tried very hard and to put together whatever necessary papers would allow them to come here. The naturalization and immigration policy then did not just allow immigrants to come to the United States. You had to have someone who would more or less be a sponsor and be responsible for you for a certain period of time, providing you a place to live and some means of support. And probably living in South America, the Russian community, since a lot of people from Germany and from Europe were being sent to South America, they maintained a brotherhood, and they collected themselves. And if one person went to the United States, well, that would be a contact that they could use in order to further their efforts to come to the United States. So it took them several years before they had any kind of a connection to somebody in the United States that would be willing to go through the legal maneuverings to get them there.
It took them 10 years, right?
It took them 10 years. They arrived in Caracas in 1948, and they did not come to the United States until April of 1958.
And when they found a sponsor, right?
Yes.
He basically helped them come right into the country.
Well, the sponsor was a family named Cherednikov, and they would have had to provide them with a place to live for 6 months and some means of earning a living. And that is, who took them in more or less and provided those things for them. And during that 6-month time, Ivan, the father, Nicholas, a son, and Anton, or Tony, they had 3 male figures who were working at any and all kinds of jobs to make money, landscaping, cutting lawns, working as carpenters. It's the late 50s in the United States, and there was a lot of, development going on, and homes were being built, and they were able to put together, a sum of money so that they could buy a home for themselves.
So, when they came here, they didn't go through Ellis Island, right?
No, I believe Ellis Island was already closed by 1958, and they arrived in New York City at what is now Kennedy Airport.
Right. So once they finally got to America, you said they were able to get jobs, right?
Yes.
All of them were able to get jobs,
Yes.
Education. Did Martha go to school, or?
No, Martha had not been schooled in South America, but coming to the United States, school is mandatory for all minor children up to the age of 16. So the two older sons, Nick and Tony, Tony was already 17 because he was born in 1941. In 1958 he was 17. He was not required to go to school, but the next two sons, Walter and Leonid, did go to school, and then Martha was the youngest. She went to school.
So Martha ended up dropping out of school, right? Or just leaving, or?
She was not sent to school in Venezuela, in Caracas. And the reason why they felt they could not send her to school is because they felt it was too dangerous to send a girl to school. I don't know what they meant by dangerous. I don't know what the circumstances were that would have made it too dangerous for a girl to go to school. It may have been that she was different from the other kids in the school, language difference, size difference. I don't know, but she was not schooled in South America, and coming here to the United States, she had to go to school. She's 11 years old. She can't start in the 6th or 7th grade. She has to start in a lower class, a 1st or 2nd grade, and she did 2 or 3 years in an elementary school level, and when she was of an age that would be considered high school, she did transfer to the older student body at a high school, and she was there until she was 16.
And then she decided to work on a family farm, right?
Well, coincidental with that, her Aunt Helen, the mother, was having multiple health issues. She had 2 different forms of cancer that required surgery and treatment and recuperation, and Martha, being a daughter, was convenient to be of a help to her mother.
Right. So after the 6 months living with the Chirignikov family, they got their own house. How did that work?
They bought a home in New Shrewsbury on Stevens Avenue, and what was being built at the time were little 4-room Cape Cods with an expansion attic, and they were satisfied with that. They had their own place, and they were now on their own, more or less.
Right. So, basically, what did they think about America once they were able to finally get their own place, work their own jobs, free education? What did they think about the whole thing?
They were very grateful to be in the United States. They were happy to be here because of the freedoms that they found. They could come and go as they please. My father-in-law always saluted the flag, and when Kate Smith, who had a television program in the late 50s, early 60s, closed her show by singing "God Bless America," my father-in-law stood up and saluted.
Wow. They definitely went through a lot of hardships along the way. When they got to America, were they assimilated easily into the culture and environment, or did they experience any problems here?
Well, I'm sure they experienced some problems. Again, people of, different ethnicities kind of congregated together. They were Russian Orthodox, so of course the Russian church was very important to them, and through that they had a community of friends that they made. They assimilated in that they learned to speak English. When they lived in South America, they learned to speak Spanish. When they lived in Germany, they learned German. As my mother-in-law said many times, if she didn't learn the language, her children didn't eat. She would have no milk for them. So they had to learn the language. The older children did learn English and reading and writing by assimilation because they were out and about in the business world. They had jobs. They had to learn how to read and write, which they did. The younger ones that were in school were educated by, the school system. And they functioned very well.
So, I know there was one situation, a Tin Man situation or something like that.
A what?
The Tin Man.
Oh.
Do you want to explain that a little bit, what happened in America?
They bought the small 4-room Cape Cod on Stevens Avenue in New Shrewsbury. And in the 50s, there was a scam, aluminum siding. They were called the Tin Men. And one of them came and knocked on their door and said, "Oh, you have such a nice house. We want to use your house as a model. We'll put aluminum siding on your house and it won't cost you anything. All you have to do is allow us to come and bring people to show them what it looks like, how it is, etc." And initially they were kind of reluctant, but they were, I guess, somewhat naive, and one of their sons said, "Oh, go ahead and do it," which they did. Well, they didn't even complete the house with aluminum siding in the same color. It's 2 different colors. And then after everything was done, come to find out that they were responsible for payment. And in fact, when they could not pay, a lien was placed on the house. And because of all of that difficulty, Ivan never signed any document in the future without having a lawyer look at it and tell him it was okay to sign.
Aside from that, though, life in America was everything they expected.
It was everything they expected and more, yes.
And do you think that the struggle that they had to go through for over 10 years of migrating and dealing with different type of people, do you think that it's helped the family now? That we were able to definitely progress, like their struggle is...
Oh, yes, because their children married. Their children had children. Their children and grandchildren are advancing in the United States. So while Ivan and Helen are not here to see it all, everything has gotten better for their posterity.
Right. And would you say that's the American dream?
It has to be the American dream. Every generation should do better than the generation before.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, I think that concludes the interview. I just want to say thank you.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.